Part 1. The community center on Maple Street had seen better days. Its beige walls were marked with scuffs from decades of use, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent buzz that most people had learned to ignore. On this particular Thursday evening in October, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small stage, where a slightly out-of-tune upright piano sat waiting. The annual talent showcase was a tradition that stretched back 30 years, a night when neighbors gathered to celebrate the hidden abilities within their small Oregon town of Riverside. Margaret Chen stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, checking off names as performers arrived. At 62, she had coordinated this event for the past 15 years, and she took quiet pride in giving everyone a chance to shine. The roster was typical for this year. The Thompson twins would perform their practice gymnastics routine, old Mr. Petrosky would recite Polish poetry, the high school jazz band would play their crowd-pleasing standards, and at least 3 people had signed up to sing popular ballads. Margaret had learned not to expect surprises anymore. The showcase was comfortable, predictable, and exactly what the community seemed to want. Among the 73 names on her list was one that had arrived just 2 days before the deadline. David Rosewood. Margaret recognized the name immediately. The Rosewood family had moved to Riverside 8 months ago when David's father took a position at the local insurance company. She had seen David around town, a lanky 17-year-old with dark curly hair who always seemed to be looking at the ground when he walked. His mother, Linda, had dropped off the registration form personally, and Margaret remembered the conversation clearly. "David wants to play piano," Linda had said, her voice carrying a mix of hope and uncertainty. "He's been taking lessons for about 6 months now. His teacher thought this might be good for his confidence." Margaret had smiled warmly and added David's name to the list without hesitation. She knew that feeling of a parent wanting their child to break out of their shell. Her own son had been painfully shy at that age. She scheduled David for the middle of the program, a safe spot where the pressure wouldn't be too intense. Beginners did better when they weren't opening or closing the show. The Rosewood family's arrival in Riverside had been quiet and unremarkable. David's father, Thomas, was a methodical man who kept to himself, and Linda worked part-time at the library. David had enrolled as a senior at Riverside High School, but he hadn't joined any clubs or sports teams. His teachers described him as polite and attentive, but almost invisible in class. He completed his assignments with careful precision, but never raised his hand to participate in discussions. At lunch, he sat alone with a book, and when other students tried to include him, he would offer a small smile and a few words before retreating back into his own world. The piano lessons had been Linda's idea. She had noticed that David spent hours in his room with headphones on, and when she asked what he was listening to, he had shown her his playlists. Classical composers, jazz pianists, contemporary instrumental artists. His eyes had lit up in a way she rarely saw when he talked about how the music made him feel. Linda had researched local piano teachers and found Eleanor Martinez, a retired concert pianist who taught from her home studio on the east side of town. Eleanor was 71 years old and had spent 40 years performing with regional orchestras before arthritis forced her to step away from the stage. Teaching had become her way of staying connected to the music she loved. When Linda called to inquire about lessons, Eleanor had been intrigued. Most of her students were children under 12, and the idea of teaching a 17-year-old beginner presented an interesting challenge. David's first lesson had been awkward. He had sat at Eleanor's grand piano with his shoulders hunched forward, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keys. Eleanor had started with the basics: posture, hand position, the layout of the keyboard. She had expected the usual frustrations that came with adult beginners, the self-consciousness about making mistakes, the impatience with slow progress. But David had surprised her. He absorbed every instruction with intense focus, and when he made errors, he didn't become discouraged. He simply tried again, adjusting his approach based on her feedback. By the third lesson, Eleanor realized that David had something she couldn't teach: an intuitive sense of musicality. When he played even the simplest exercises, there was a quality to his touch that suggested deep listening. He wasn't just pressing keys in the correct order, he was thinking about the sound he wanted to create. Eleanor began to push him harder, introducing concepts that she normally wouldn't cover until students had been playing for at least a year. David practiced obsessively. Linda would hear him at the family's digital keyboard late into the night, working through scales and arpeggios, then attempting pieces that seemed far beyond his technical level. When she expressed concern about him overworking himself, he had looked at her with an earnestness that caught her off guard. "It's the only time I feel like myself," he had said quietly. Thomas had been skeptical about the lessons at first, viewing them as an expensive hobby that would likely fade after a few months. But even he had noticed the change in his son. David seemed less withdrawn at dinner, more willing to engage in conversation. The tension that had marked their family life since the move began to ease slightly. When Alina suggested that David perform at the community showcase, his immediate reaction was refusal. The idea of playing in front of strangers terrified him. But Alina had been persuasive in her gentle way. She reminded him that music was meant to be shared, that keeping it locked inside himself meant missing the point of why music mattered. Linda had added her encouragement, seeing the showcase as a potential turning point for David's social isolation. After 3 days of internal debate, David had agreed, but only on the condition that he could choose what to play. Alina had expected him to select one of the intermediate-level pieces they had been working on, something safe and well within his current abilities. Instead, David had arrived at his next lesson with sheet music for a piece that made Alina's eyebrows rise in concern. "This is extremely difficult," she had said, studying the complex notation. "Even for advanced players, this would require months of preparation." "I know," David had replied, "but this is the piece I need to play." Alina had wanted to talk him out of it, to guide him toward something more appropriate for his skill level, but something in David's expression stopped her. This wasn't youthful arrogance or naive optimism. This was determination born from a place she recognized, the same place that had driven her own relationship with music for decades. She had agreed to help him prepare, though privately she worried about setting him up for a very public failure. The piece David had chosen was a contemporary composition by a relatively unknown composer named Vincent Zhao, titled Conversations in the Dark. It was a haunting work that required not just technical precision, but emotional depth and interpretive maturity. The music moved between moments of delicate introspection and passages of intense complexity, demanding that the pianist maintain absolute control while also surrendering to the emotional arc of the piece. For the next 6 weeks, David had worked on nothing else. Alina had broken the piece down into manageable sections, drilling him on the difficult passages until his fingers could navigate them with increasing confidence. But technical proficiency was only part of the challenge. Alina had spent hours talking with David about the emotional landscape of the music, about what it meant to communicate feeling through sound, about the vulnerability required to truly perform rather than simply play notes correctly. David had listened to everything Alina taught him, but he also brought his own interpretation to the work. During their sessions, Alina began to see glimpses of something she hadn't witnessed in years: a young musician discovering their own voice. There were moments when David would play a phrase in a way she hadn't suggested, adding a subtle emphasis or pulling back the tempo in a manner that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. She found herself making fewer corrections and offering more encouragement. As the showcase approached, Linda had asked David multiple times if he was sure about his choice, if he wouldn't prefer to play something less demanding for his first public performance. Each time, David had assured her that he was ready, though she could see the anxiety building in the way he carried himself. The night before the event, she had found him sitting at the keyboard with his hands in his lap, not playing, just staring at the keys. "What if I mess up?" he had asked without looking at her. Linda had sat down next to him, choosing her words carefully. "Then you mess up, but you'll have tried something brave, and that matters more than perfection." Now, as people began filing into the community center, David sat with his parents in the back row, his leg bouncing nervously. He wore a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks, clothes that Linda had helped him pick out. His hands felt cold and slightly numb, and he kept flexing his fingers, trying to maintain the sense of connection with them that he would need when his turn came. The audience was a cross-section of Riverside's population. Elderly couples who attended every community event regardless of content sat in the front rows. Parents with young children filled the middle sections, juggling snacks and whispered instructions about sitting still. Teenagers clustered near the back, most of them present to support friends who were performing. The room buzzed with friendly conversation, the comfortable noise of a community gathering. Margaret took the stage promptly at 7 o'clock, welcoming everyone and reminding them to silence their phones. She outlined the evening's program, 19 acts spread over approximately 2 hours. The Thompson twins opened the show with their energetic gymnastics routine, earning enthusiastic applause. Mr. Petroska's poetry was met with respectful appreciation, though few in the audience spoke Polish. The high school jazz band delivered a competent performance of Take 5 that had several people tapping their feet. As each act finished, David's anxiety intensified. He watched a young girl sing a pop song slightly off-key, her parents beaming with pride. He saw a middle-aged man perform magic tricks that were charming despite their transparency. Everyone seemed so comfortable up there, so willing to be imperfect in front of others. David couldn't imagine that kind of ease. When Margaret announced his name, David felt his mother's hand squeeze his shoulder. He stood on legs that didn't quite feel like his own and made his way down the aisle toward the stage. The walk seemed to take forever and no time at all. He was aware of faces turning toward him, of whispers from people who recognized him as the quiet new kid. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage and crossed to the piano, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room. David sat on the bench and adjusted its height slightly, a mechanical action that gave him a moment to breathe. He looked out at the audience and immediately regretted it. There were so many people, all of them watching him, waiting for him to begin. His hands trembled as he placed them on the keys. In the 3rd row, he spotted Alina, her expression calm and encouraging. That small anchor of familiarity helped him focus. He closed his eyes, blocking out the faces and the lights and the weight of expectation. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he found the music waiting for him. This was why he had agreed to perform, why he had chosen such a difficult piece, why he had pushed himself beyond what seemed reasonable. The music existed independent of his fear, and if he could just reach it, everything else would fall away. David took one more breath, feeling his heartbeat begin to slow. His fingers settled onto the keys with sudden certainty. In the audience, people shifted in their seats, preparing to hear what they assumed would be a tentative, careful performance from a nervous teenager. Margaret made a mental note to lead the applause warmly when he finished, knowing how much encouragement meant to young performers. Linda gripped Thomas's hand tightly, silently praying that whatever happened next, her son would survive it emotionally intact. No one in that room in that moment had any idea what they were about to experience. David's first note hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. It was a single key pressed with such precise control that the sound seemed to materialize rather than begin. The room, which had been filled with the rustling of programs and the clearing of throats, fell into an unexpected stillness. That first note was followed by another, then a delicate progression of sounds that moved through the space with the quality of something alive and breathing. Alina Martinez sat forward in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. She had heard David play this opening dozens of times during their practice sessions, but something was different now. The nervousness that had marked his rehearsals had vanished, replaced by a certainty that came from somewhere beyond technical training. His posture at the piano had transformed from the hunched uncertainty of his arrival to a focused engagement that suggested complete absorption in the music. The piece began quietly, almost conversationally, as its title suggested. David's right hand carried a melodic line that felt like someone speaking in hushed tones, while his left hand provided gentle harmonic support. The notes were simple at first, accessible, the kind of opening that made listeners lean in to hear better. But within those simple notes was a quality of touch that Margaret Chen, sitting near the back with her clipboard forgotten in her lap, had never heard from any performer on this stage in 15 years of organizing the showcase. Linda Rosewood felt tears forming before she understood why. She watched her son's profile, saw the concentration in his face, but more than that, she saw something she had been searching for since they moved to Riverside. Her son fully present, fully himself, unguarded and unafraid. Thomas sat motionless beside her, his usual analytical mind struggling to process what he was hearing. He had attended David's lessons a few times, had heard him practice at home, but this was something else entirely. This was the difference between hearing someone speak and hearing them tell a truth that mattered. The music began to build. David's hands moved across the keys with increasing complexity, the conversation in the dark growing more urgent. The right hand climbed higher on the keyboard while the left hand descended, creating a sense of space and depth that filled the community center in a way that seemed impossible from such a modest instrument. The old upright piano, which everyone in Riverside knew was slightly out of tune and had a few keys that stuck, suddenly sounded like it had been waiting its entire existence for someone to play it this way. In the audience, people who had come expecting amateur entertainment found themselves caught off guard by the emotional weight of what they were hearing. Sarah Mitchell, a music teacher at the elementary school, sat with her mouth slightly open, her professional ear recognizing not just competence but artistry. She had performed in this showcase herself 3 years ago, had considered herself the most musically accomplished person in Riverside, and now she felt humbled by what this teenager was creating. The Thompson twins, fresh from their gymnastics routine, had been whispering to each other in the back row until their mother shushed them. Now they sat in complete silence, even their restless energy stilled by the music. Something about the sounds coming from the piano reached past their young understanding and touched something deeper, a response to beauty that existed before words could explain it. David navigated through the first major technical challenge of the piece, a passage where his hands crossed repeatedly, the right hand diving below the left to strike bass notes while the left hand carried the melody in the middle register. He had practiced this section hundreds of times, had struggled with it for weeks until a leaner helped him understand the physical mechanics of the movement. Now it flowed from him as if his body had always known how to do this, as if the weeks of frustration and repetition had been necessary not to learn the motion, but to forget that it had ever been difficult. The music shifted into a more turbulent section. The gentle conversation gave way to something that felt like an argument, like two voices refusing to find common ground. David's playing grew more forceful, his fingers striking the keys with increased intensity. The dynamic swelled, and several people in the audience felt their heart rates quicken in response. This wasn't background music or pleasant entertainment anymore. This was something that demanded attention and emotional engagement. Alina recognized that David had made a choice in this section that differed from what they had practiced. He was pushing the tempo slightly faster than she had suggested, leaning into the urgency rather than controlling it. For a split second, she worried that he might lose control, that the technical demands would overwhelm him. But David held the line perfectly, his hands moving with a combination of abandon and precision that seemed contradictory but somehow coexisted. In the middle of the turbulent section, there was a moment where the music stopped completely. A full rest, a beat of absolute silence that David held for exactly the right length of time. In that silence, the audience collectively held its breath. The pause felt loaded with meaning, like the space between a question and its answer, like the moment before something irreversible happens. Then David's hands came down on a chord that resonated through the room with such emotional force that several people gasped audibly. Margaret Chen found herself thinking about her own life in that moment, about the choices she had made and the paths she hadn't taken. The music seemed to be speaking directly to something in her experience that she had kept carefully buried under years of routine and responsibility. She glanced around and saw similar expressions on other faces, people confronting their own internal landscapes through the medium of sound. The piece moved into its most technically demanding section, a cascade of notes that required David's hands to move with speed and accuracy that seemed almost superhuman. This was the passage that had terrified Alina when David first showed her the sheet music, the part that she had been certain would be beyond his abilities. But David had practiced this section with an obsessive dedication that bordered on compulsive. He had broken it down into tiny fragments, had worked on each hand separately, had played it backwards and forwards, had visualized it while lying in bed at night. Now, under the fluorescent lights of the community center, with 73 pairs of eyes watching him, David's fingers flew across the keys with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone who had been playing piano for only 6 months. The notes tumbled over each other like water rushing downstream, each one clear and distinct despite the incredible speed. His right hand raced up the keyboard while his left hand provided a steady rhythmic foundation, and the two hands worked together with the synchronization of something that had been rehearsed for years rather than months. Sarah Mitchell, the music teacher, knew enough about piano technique to understand what she was witnessing. This level of control shouldn't have been possible for someone so new to the instrument. She had students who had been playing for 5 years who couldn't execute passages half this difficult. She found herself wondering if perhaps David had been playing much longer than the 6 months his mother had mentioned to Margaret, if perhaps he had studied as a child and was only recently returning to the instrument. But Alina knew the truth. She had been there from the beginning, had witnessed David's first fumbling attempts at scales, had seen his journey from complete beginner to this moment. What she was seeing wasn't the result of hidden prior experience, but rather something else. Something that existed at the intersection of natural talent, obsessive dedication, and a deep personal need to express what couldn't be expressed any other way. David had found in music what he couldn't find in words or relationships or any other aspect of his life. A way to be completely himself without fear of judgment or rejection. The cascade of notes resolved into a quieter passage, and David's playing softened again. The music became introspective, almost meditative. His hands moved more slowly now, each note given space to breathe and resonate before the next one arrived. This section of the piece was marked by long, sustained tones in the left hand, while the right hand traced delicate patterns above, like someone thinking out loud, working through complex emotions in real time. Thomas Rosewood felt something shift in his understanding of his son. He had always seen David as fragile, as someone who needed to be pushed toward normalcy and social engagement. He had worried constantly about David's isolation, his lack of friends, his reluctance to participate in the typical activities of teenage life. But watching David now, Thomas realized that his son wasn't broken or incomplete. David simply experienced the world differently, felt things more intensely, and had been searching for a way to channel that intensity into something meaningful. The piano had given him that channel, and what was flowing through it now was remarkable. The audience had stopped thinking about what would come next on the program, or when they could check their phones, or whether they had remembered to turn off the oven at home. All of those mundane concerns had evaporated in the presence of something that felt genuinely important. People who had never particularly cared about classical music found themselves completely absorbed. The elderly couple in the front row sat holding hands, their faces reflecting a shared recognition of beauty. The teenagers in the back had stopped their usual posturing and were listening with an attention that their teachers would have envied. David entered the final section of the piece, where the two competing voices of the earlier passages began to find resolution. The music didn't become simple or easy, but it found a kind of harmony that felt earned rather than imposed. His hands worked together now, supporting each other rather than conflicting, creating textures that were rich and complex but no longer turbulent. There was a sense of something being worked through, of a journey that had found its destination not through arrival at a new place, but through acceptance of the journey itself. The community center had never been designed as a concert hall. Its acoustics were mediocre at best, and the old upright piano was a serviceable instrument but nothing special. Yet in this moment, with David Rosewood playing Conversations in the Dark, the space transformed into something sacred. The shabby walls and flickering fluorescent lights ceased to matter. What mattered was the connection being forged between the young man at the piano and every person in the room, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience. Alina felt tears running down her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. In 40 years of performing and 30 years of teaching, she had rarely experienced music that moved her this deeply. She had played in grand concert halls with perfect acoustics and magnificent instruments, had received standing ovations from sophisticated audiences, but none of that compared to what she was feeling now. This was why music mattered, why it had consumed her entire life. This was the moment when sound became something more than sound, when technique became transparent and what remained was pure human expression. The piece was approaching its conclusion. David's hands moved through the final phrases with a tenderness that felt almost unbearable. The conversation in the dark was ending, not with answers but with acceptance, not with resolution but with peace. The notes grew softer and softer, his fingers barely touching the keys, the sound fading like a light being slowly dimmed. The final chord came, held just long enough, then released into silence. David lifted his hands from the keyboard and let them rest in his lap. He didn't move otherwise, didn't turn to face the audience, didn't acknowledge that he had finished. He sat very still, his eyes closed, breathing slowly, as if he were returning from somewhere far away and needed a moment to remember where he was. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. The audience sat frozen, caught between what they had just experienced and the return to ordinary awareness. It was the kind of silence that follows something significant, when people need time to process before they can react, when the normal social responses feel inadequate to the moment. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds, though it felt much longer to everyone in the room. Margaret Chen sat with her clipboard pressed against her chest, her prepared remarks about thanking the performer completely forgotten. She had witnessed hundreds of acts on this stage over the years, had clapped politely for sincere efforts and impressive talents alike, but she had never experienced a moment quite like this. The air in the community center felt different somehow, charged with something that couldn't be named but could definitely be felt. In the third row, Alina Martinez was the first to move. She rose to her feet slowly, her arthritic knees protesting the movement, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her hands came together in applause that started quietly but grew in intensity. The sound of her clapping broke the spell that had held the audience suspended, and within seconds, other people began to stand. Sarah Mitchell shot to her feet almost immediately after Alina, her hands coming together with a force that made them sting. The elderly couple in the front row stood together, their applause enthusiastic despite their age. Thomas Rosewood stood and pulled Linda up with him, both of them clapping with an intensity that surprised them. Row by row, the entire audience rose until every single person in the community center was standing, their applause building into something that sounded less like polite appreciation and more like a collective release of emotion. David finally opened his eyes and turned to face the audience. The sight of everyone on their feet, their hands coming together in waves of sound that echoed off the walls, sent a shock through his system that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. His face flushed red, and for a moment, Alina worried that he might run from the stage. But David remained seated on the piano bench, his hands gripping its edge, his eyes wide as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The applause continued, sustained by genuine enthusiasm rather than social obligation. People weren't just clapping because it was the appropriate response to a performance. They were clapping because they had been moved, because they had experienced something unexpected and profound. because they wanted to express a gratitude that went beyond simple appreciation for entertainment. Linda Rosewood was crying openly now, her hands still coming together even as tears ran down her cheeks. She had spent months worrying about David's adjustment to their new town, had agonized over his isolation and his inability to connect with peers. She had watched him retreat further into himself and had felt increasingly helpless about how to reach him. But now, seeing her son on that stage, seeing the response he was generating from this room full of near strangers, she understood that he had been connecting all along, just not in the ways she had expected. The piano had been his bridge, and this performance was him finally crossing it. Margaret finally found her voice and made her way to the stage. She climbed the steps with her usual efficiency, but her face showed an emotion that few people in Riverside had ever seen from her. Genuine awe, she approached David, who was still sitting at the piano bench looking overwhelmed, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying through the room as the applause began to fade. "Absolutely extraordinary." David stood awkwardly, unsure of what he was supposed to do next. Margaret guided him toward the front of the stage, and the movement triggered a fresh wave of applause. He managed a small, uncertain bow, his movements stiff with self-consciousness. But when he looked out at the faces watching him, he saw something he had never seen directed at himself before: recognition. Not just acknowledgement of his presence, but recognition of something deeper. As if the music had allowed these strangers to see who he actually was in a way that normal social interaction never could. As David left the stage and made his way back to his seat, people reached out to touch his arm or shoulder as he passed. The Thompson twins stared at him with something approaching reverence. Mr. Ketrosky, who had recited his poetry earlier, nodded with the respect of one artist acknowledging another. A woman David didn't know, someone's grandmother who had probably attended 1,000 community events, looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered thank you as he walked by. When David reached his parents, his mother pulled him into a fierce hug that he returned with unusual openness. His father gripped his shoulder with a hand that trembled slightly, and Thomas's eyes were suspiciously bright. They sat down together, but the energy around them had changed. People in nearby seats kept glancing over, offering small smiles or nods, a kind of acknowledgement that David had never experienced before. Alina remained standing in her row, watching David settle back into his seat. She felt a complex mixture of pride and something close to grief. She recognized that she had just witnessed the birth of something that would take David away from her small studio and into a much larger world. This was what she had always hoped for from her students, but had rarely seen. The transformation from someone learning notes to someone speaking through music with their own voice. It was beautiful and bittersweet, like watching a child take their first independent steps. Margaret returned to the microphone to announce the next performer, but there was an awkwardness to the transition that everyone felt. How did you follow what had just happened? The next act was a woman who sang a Broadway ballad with competent technique and obvious enjoyment. She performed well by any reasonable standard, but the room's energy had shifted. The audience clapped politely when she finished, but the applause felt hollow compared to what had come before. The woman herself seemed to sense it, her smile faltering slightly as she left the stage. The remaining performances suffered from the same problem. Each act was met with appropriate appreciation, but an unspoken comparison hung in the air. The high school jazz band's second set, which closed the show, was technically proficient and well-rehearsed, but it felt routine in a way it wouldn't have if David's performance hadn't preceded it. When Margaret finally thanked everyone for coming and announced that refreshments were available in the adjoining room, there was a palpable sense of relief that the formal program was over. The refreshment room filled quickly with people eager to discuss what they had witnessed. Clusters formed around the coffee and cookies, and David's name was on everyone's lips. Sarah Mitchell found herself surrounded by other teachers asking if she had known about David's talent, if she had heard him play before, if she understood how someone so young and so new to the instrument could perform at that level. "I had no idea," Sarah admitted, still processing what she had heard. "I've seen him in the hallways at school, but he's so quiet, I never would have guessed." Alina stood near the punch bowl, fielding questions from people who wanted to know about David's training. She answered truthfully that he had been her student for only 6 months, but she could see the skepticism in their faces. It seemed impossible, and part of her understood their doubt. What David had accomplished in 6 months typically took years to develop. She tried to explain about his dedication, his practice habits, his intuitive musicality, but words felt inadequate to capture the reality of what made David's playing special. David himself had become the reluctant center of attention. People approached him tentatively at first, then with increasing boldness as the evening progressed. They wanted to congratulate him, to ask him questions about his training, to tell him how much his playing had moved them. For someone who had spent 8 months in Riverside barely speaking to anyone, the sudden flood of social interaction was overwhelming. A retired professor named Harold Weinstein, who had taught music history at a university 2 hours away before moving to Riverside, pushed through the crowd to reach David. Harold had attended the showcase on a whim, expecting nothing more than a pleasant evening of amateur performances. What he had heard from David had shocked him with its maturity and depth. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard, "have you considered applying to conservatory?" David looked at him blankly. "Conservatory? A music school," Harold clarified. "Juilliard, Curtis, Berkeley, any of the top programs. With your talent, you should be studying with the best teachers, not wasting your time in a town like this." Linda, who had been standing protectively near her son, bristled slightly at the implication that Riverside was somehow beneath David's talents. But before she could respond, Eleanor appeared at David's other side. "Harold's right that you have exceptional talent," Eleanor said carefully, "but let's not get ahead of ourselves. David has only been playing for 6 months. There's still a great deal of foundation work to be done." Harold waved dismissively. "Foundation work can be done anywhere. What this boy has can't be taught. It's either there or it isn't, and it's clearly there." David felt the conversation spinning away from him, these adults discussing his future as if he weren't standing right there. The praise was simultaneously thrilling and suffocating. He had played the piece because he needed to express something that lived inside him, not because he wanted to launch a career or impress academics or change his entire life trajectory. The weight of expectation that was suddenly settling on his shoulders felt heavier than stage fright had been. Across the room, Thomas watched his son being surrounded by well-meaning people offering advice and predictions about his future. He felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. Just hours ago, David had been his quiet, isolated son who struggled to fit in. Now suddenly, David was being called exceptional, remarkable, gifted. Thomas wanted to feel unambiguously happy about this recognition, but he worried about the pressure it might create, about what would happen if David couldn't maintain this level of performance, about whether this single evening might set expectations that would ultimately crush rather than elevate his son. Margaret Chen observed all of this from the doorway, her clipboard once again forgotten. In 15 years of organizing the showcase, she had never seen anything like this aftermath. Usually people chatted briefly, collected their children, and headed home by 9 o'clock. Tonight it was approaching 10, and the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. The energy in the room crackled with excitement and possibility, with people feeling like they had witnessed something significant and wanting to hold onto that feeling as long as possible. A local reporter named James Whitmore, who covered community events for the Riverside Gazette, had been at the showcase documenting the evening for his weekly column. He typically wrote brief, cheerful summaries of these events, focusing on the community spirit rather than the quality of the performances. But tonight demanded something different. He had recorded David's performance on his phone and had already listened to it twice while standing in the corner of the refreshment room. He knew that this was a story that transcended the usual scope of his reporting. James approached David during a brief moment when the crowd around him had thinned. "Would you be willing to do an interview for the newspaper?" he asked. "I think people in the community would love to know more about you and your music." David's eyes widened with alarm and Linda stepped in smoothly. "That's very kind of you, but David is quite private. Perhaps we could think about it and get back to you." James nodded understandingly but left his card anyway. As he walked away, he was already composing the article in his head, trying to find words that would capture what that performance had felt like. He had covered hundreds of local events over his 20 years at the Gazette, and he prided himself on his ability to find the human interest angle in any story. But this felt different, bigger somehow, like the beginning of something rather than just another pleasant evening in a small town. Eleanor finally managed to extract David from the crowd, suggesting that he must be exhausted and should head home. Linda and Thomas agreed immediately, grateful for the excuse to leave. As they made their way toward the exit, people continued to stop them, offering final congratulations and expressions of amazement. By the time they reached their car in the parking lot, all three of them felt drained from the intensity of the social interaction. The drive home was quiet. David sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the dark streets of Riverside passing by. His mind was churning through everything that had happened, trying to process the transformation from terrified teenager sitting at a piano to the object of intense attention and praise. He felt simultaneously vindicated and exposed, proud and frightened, exhilarated and exhausted. Linda kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, wanting to say something profound and maternal but unable to find the right words. Thomas drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel. his mind already racing ahead to practical concerns about how this development might affect David's college applications, his academic focus, his future plans. When they pulled into their driveway, David got out of the car without waiting for his parents and went straight to his room. Linda started to follow him, but Thomas put a hand on her arm, shaking his head. "Let him process," he said quietly. This was a lot. Linda reluctantly agreed, though every maternal instinct told her to check on her son. Instead, she and Thomas sat at the kitchen table, drinking tea neither of them wanted, talking in low voices about what had just happened and what it might mean. Upstairs, David sat at his digital keyboard with the headphones on, but he didn't play. His hands rested on the keys, feeling their familiar texture, but he couldn't bring himself to press them. The performance had taken something from him, had pulled out emotions and vulnerabilities that he usually kept carefully locked away. The idea of accessing that place again, even in the privacy of his own room, felt impossible right now. Instead, he thought about the moment when he had lifted his hands from the piano and heard that initial silence before the applause began. In that silence, he had felt completely himself in a way that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The music had allowed him to communicate things he couldn't express any other way, had built a bridge between his internal world and the external one that usually felt so foreign and hostile. But now that the bridge existed, now that people had crossed it and seen what was on the other side, he couldn't unbuild it. The isolation that had protected him for so long had been breached, and there was no way to seal it back up. David wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse, if he had freed himself or trapped himself in new and different ways. He finally took off the headphones and lay down on his bed, still fully dressed. Sleep felt impossible, but he closed his eyes anyway, trying to quiet the noise in his head. Outside his window, Riverside continued its quiet existence, unaware that something had shifted, that a story had begun that would ripple far beyond this small Oregon town. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that usually made David feel slightly more optimistic about the world. But as he walked through the halls of Riverside High School, he felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Word had spread with the supernatural speed that only high school gossip could achieve. Students he had never spoken to stared at him openly. A group of girls by the lockers stopped their conversation mid-sentence as he passed, then immediately resumed it in urgent whispers once he was out of earshot. By second period, David had been approached by 7 different people, each offering some variation of "I heard you were amazing last night," or "everyone's talking about your performance." The attention felt like pressure against his skin, making him want to find a quiet corner and disappear into it. He had spent 8 months carefully constructing an invisibility that kept him safe from the social complexities of high school. 20 minutes of playing piano had dismantled that invisibility completely. The school's music teacher, Mr. Dennis Carver, intercepted David on his way to English class. Dennis was a well-meaning man in his mid-40s who directed the school band and taught general music classes with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his subject, despite the administrative constraints and limited budget that hampered his programs. "David," Dennis said, slightly out of breath from hurrying to catch him. "I heard about last night. Sarah Mitchell called me this morning. She said your performance was extraordinary." David shifted his backpack uncomfortably. "It was just a community showcase thing. From what I hear, it was considerably more than that." Dennis pulled out his phone and showed David a video that someone had recorded. The quality was poor, the audio distorted by the phone's microphone, but even through the technical limitations, the power of the performance came through. "This has been shared around social media all morning. You're kind of famous right now." The thought made David's anxiety spike sharply. He had never wanted to be famous. He had wanted to play that piece because it mattered to him personally, because the music expressed something he couldn't articulate any other way. The idea that his deeply personal expression was now being shared on social media, viewed by strangers who would judge and comment and form opinions, felt like a violation of something sacred. "I need to get to class," David managed, edging away from Dennis. Of course," Dennis said quickly. "But listen, I'd love to talk to you about maybe performing for the school or joining our music program. We have a spring concert coming up, and having someone of your caliber would really elevate the whole production." David nodded vaguely and escaped into his English classroom, where he slid into his usual seat in the back corner. His classmates watched him enter with new interest. Jessica Huang, who sat 2 desks over and had never acknowledged his existence in the 3 months they had shared this class, leaned toward him with a bright smile. "Hey, David. I didn't know you played piano. That video going around is insane. You're really talented." "Thanks," David mumbled, opening his textbook and hoping she would take the hint. But Jessica persisted, her enthusiasm genuine even if it was overwhelming. "Seriously, where did you learn to play like that? Have you been studying for years?" 6 months, David said quietly, not looking up from his book. Jessica's eyes widened. 6 months? That's impossible. My cousin has been playing for 8 years and she can't play anything like that. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Palmer calling the class to order, but David could feel Jessica's attention remaining on him even as she turned to face the front. The morning dragged on with similar interactions in each class. By lunch, David seriously considered leaving campus and walking home, but he knew that would only create more attention when his parents were called. Instead, he retreated to his usual spot in the library, hoping that the quiet space would provide some refuge. But even there, he found no peace. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, who happened to be Margaret's sister-in-law and had heard detailed accounts of the performance over breakfast, greeted him with unusual warmth. "David, Margaret told me all about last night. She said it was the best performance in the showcase's 30-year history. You should be very proud." David managed a weak smile and headed to his corner table, but he had barely sat down when 3 students from the school newspaper approached. The editor, an intense senior named Alicia Wang, sat down across from him without invitation. "David Rosewood, we'd like to do a feature on you for the next issue. Student talent spotlight, that sort of thing. It would be great exposure." "I don't really want exposure," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia leaned forward, her expression earnest. "But you should. What you did last night was important. People are inspired by it. Don't you want to share your gift?" David felt trapped by the question. How could he explain that his playing wasn't about sharing a gift or inspiring others? It was about survival, about finding a way to process the overwhelming intensity of his internal experience. The performance had been a moment of vulnerability that he had controlled, contained within the structure of the music. This aftermath, this exposure and attention and expectation, was the exact opposite of what he needed. "Please just leave me alone," he said, more forcefully than he intended. Alicia pulled back, hurt flashing across her face before being replaced by professional disappointment. "Okay. But if you change your mind, we'd really love to tell your story." They left, and David put his head down on the table, fighting the urge to cry from sheer frustration. He had thought that playing well would solve something, would give him a moment of connection and understanding. Instead, it had created a new set of problems that felt even more complicated than his original isolation. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Are you okay? Mrs. Palmer called and said you seemed upset in class." David stared at the message, not knowing how to respond. How could he explain that success felt worse than invisibility, that recognition was more painful than being ignored? He eventually typed back, "I'm fine," knowing it was a lie but unable to articulate the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Elena Martinez was fielding phone calls from people she hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues from her performing days had somehow learned about David's performance and were calling to ask questions, to express interest, to offer advice she hadn't requested. Word had spread through music education networks with remarkable speed, amplified by that grainy video that kept being shared and reshared. A professor from the Portland Conservatory of Music called just after noon. "Elena, I saw the video. Even with the terrible audio quality, I can hear that this student has something special. I'd like to arrange an audition." Elena felt torn between pride in David's abilities and protectiveness of his fragile emotional state. "Professor Chen, I appreciate your interest, but David is still very much a beginner in many ways. He has technical gaps that need to be addressed before he's ready for conservatory-level training." "Elena, you know as well as I do that what makes a musician great isn't technical perfection. It's what that young man demonstrated last night, the ability to communicate something true through music. That can't be taught, only nurtured. If he continues studying in a vacuum, he'll never develop his full potential." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Elena finding herself defending David's need for time and space, while simultaneously recognizing that Professor Chen's points had merit. When she finally hung up, she felt exhausted and uncertain. She had been teaching for 3 decades and had never faced this particular dilemma: how to protect a student from the consequences of their own exceptional talent. At the Riverside Gazette, James Whitmore was writing an article that he knew would be the most significant piece of his journalism career. He had covered decades of city council meetings, school board disputes, local business openings, and community events. He had written thousands of words about Riverside's ordinary life, finding beauty and meaning in the mundane rhythms of a small town. But David's performance had given him something different. A story about transcendence, about the moment when the ordinary revealed itself to be extraordinary. His editor, Maria Santos, read his draft and looked up with surprise. "This is beautiful, James, but it's a lot for a community showcase. We usually give these events a few paragraphs, maybe a photo. You've written 1,200 words. Maria, you had to be there. This wasn't just a good performance. It was something that changed the room, changed the people in it." I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of covering this town. Maria studied the article again, then nodded slowly. Okay, we'll run it as the cover story. But I want a photo. Do you have ones? James did have photos, several of them taken on his phone during and after the performance. He selected one that captured David at the piano, his profile visible, his hands on the keys, his expression showing complete absorption. It wasn't a perfect photograph by professional standards, but it conveyed something essential about the moment. The article would run in the Sunday edition, which had the widest circulation of the week. James had no way of knowing that his 1,200 words would be picked up by the regional news, then by a national wire service, then by a music blog with significant industry readership. He was simply trying to capture something true about what he had witnessed, unaware that he was about to amplify David's exposure far beyond Riverside's borders. By the time school ended on Friday, David felt like he had been through an ordeal. He walked home quickly, ignoring attempts by other students to catch his attention. When he reached his house, he found his mother waiting for him with an expression of concern that immediately put him on guard. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about what's happening," Linda said gently. David dropped his backpack by the door. "I just want to practice." "I know, but there are things we need to discuss. You have people wanting to interview you, teachers wanting you to perform, that professor who called a leaner about auditions. This is getting complicated." "I didn't ask for any of this," David said, his voice rising with frustration. "I just played a piece of music. Why can't everyone just leave me alone?" Linda reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. "David, I understand this is overwhelming, but these people are responding to something real. You're playing this." Response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue.